And if we really want to get ourselves confused by this, or maybe a nicer way to put it is if we really want to understand what's going on with these things, let's look at a more complicated example by introducing some inheritance to this. So here, oops, not too far, we have a class called superclass, which implies that we're going to extend it down below, and we do. It's going to have an instance initializer block that just prints something out. It's going to declare an instance variable with inline initialization. It's going to have another instance initializer block, and we'll see that this instance initializer block can actually use this variable if we want, and we do. And then we have a static initializer block for the superclass, followed by its constructors. Then our base class, called inheritance initializers, extends that superclass. It has an instance initializer block. It has a default constructor that will call the superclass constructor with a 4 as a parameter. It's got a main method that we'll look at in a second to do some stuff. And it's got a static initializer block down here. It's got a string constructor, which then calls this other one first. And it's got a print method. So again, all kinds of stuff. Again, only code that Dr. Lim could write. And let's see what's going on with this. So getting to Mike's question a few minutes ago, is this a way to get some things to execute in a superclass before your the various constructors are called? What we want to do is, let me run it and then we'll analyze what's going on with it. We know for sure that the static stuff should happen first. Right? Static initializer blocks are going to happen during the startup of the whole program before main even happens. The only question is, does it do the superclass first or does it do the derived class first? And we'll see. And then the other thing to think about with this one is when I construct an instance of inheritance initializers, which is also something that extends superclass, what is the order of the instance initializers relative to the constructors? So I'm going to clear this so we can see the whole thing. There's a lot going on in this one. All right, so we start out, before we print out beginning of main, we see that the 2 static initializer blocks happened first, and it's going down the inheritance tree. So superclasses, static initializer block happens, and then inheritance initializer, static initializer block happens. So the base class, then the derived class. And if we had a deeper inheritance hierarchy, it would follow its way down. If we had lots of classes, I don't know how it would decide which ones come before others. And I think we don't really want to go there. All right, so then the other piece to really analyze here for a couple of minutes is when I call this constructor. Well, this constructor is the string constructor that's down at the bottom. Let me, so we can see it. So this constructor will first call the default constructor up here, and that one will first call the constructor that takes an int of superclass. So if we're looking at the actual constructor things, they're happening in the order we'd expect. The superclass int constructor will execute, then the 0 argument constructor will execute, and then the string argument constructor will execute. But interspersed with those, we have our instance initializer blocks. And it turns out that it does the superclass first. So if we think about what's happening here, I'm about to construct this thing. The first thing is the 2 initializer blocks of superclass get called. Then it calls the superclass constructor. Wow. Then Then anyway, it calls the initializer block of the base class, and then it calls the constructor of the base class. I'm sorry, the derived class, not the base class. So it's kind of interspersing these things. Everything that has to do with the superclass happens, and then everything that has to do with the subclass happens. And that is your last question here on that document we're filling in today. Based on these examples, what order do things happen? And I'm talking about in terms of static things happening and instance things happening on object construction. So if you can give me a 2 or 3 sentence, 1 paragraph, something like that, summary of what we think we learned from going through these examples today, and you might have to go back and look at them again, that answer will be more than enough to get you through any questions that have to be, any short answer questions that relate to this when we have a final exam next week. But really the point of this is not to prepare for the final exam, but just to realize that these are features that Java has. And if we're going to be considering ourselves advanced Java programmers, whether or not we decide to use them, we should be aware of them because we could encounter them. Anyway,